Hello, everybody. My name is Jeff Johnston. I work on the Eclipse IDE team in Red Hat, Toronto. I'm a fairly new JDT committer, mostly specializing in UI changes. I'm also the project lead for the Eclipse Linux Tools project, and I'm a committer on the Eclipse CDT. Today, I'm going to be discussing what's new in JDT since the last EclipseCon. Since the last EclipseCon, there have been four full releases of the JDT, 4.14 all the way to 4.17. This has covered Java support from Java 13 all the way to Java 15. You'll notice that in some cases, the Java support requires the Eclipse Marketplace. This is due to the fact that the release dates of the JDT and Java don't sync up, and the JDT releases ahead of time. Once the Java release is official, then it's available through the Eclipse Marketplace. You'll see that on the 3-month release cadence that the next release, for example, the 4.16, has the Java 14 support. There's also been a milestone one for 4.18 that just got released. I provided a link here for if you wanted to get the latest and greatest Java 15 support for the 4.17. So I'm going to discuss some of the new Java features, starting with switch expressions. So the switch expression is similar to a switch statement, only in that it yields a value. This value, in this particular example, can be assigned to a local variable or returned as part of a method. The difference, one of the major differences between the switch expression and the switch statement is there are no break statements. A switch statement also needs to cover all the input values that are possible. And usually that means of having a default clause, but it can also, in the case of, for example, an enum, it can just cover all of the possible input values. In this particular switch expression example, I'm using the new case label. The case label is like the regular case, only that it can have multiple constants. So for example, I could have case 3, 4, and you'll also notice that the arrow notation here, after the arrow notation, they requires a single expression, a throw statement, or a block. And the block must either end in a throw statement or the new yield statement, which you see here. You can create a switch expression with the old format case. In that particular thing, every case must either fall through to another case that yields a value or throws an exception. Another new feature is the text block. The text block starts with 3 double quotes and ends in 3 double quotes. It's convenient for large chunks of text that you want to grab perhaps from a file or, for example, a code sample. The text block itself, by default, all white space to the right is truncated and replaced by a new line. And on the left-hand side, the line with the minimum indent is used to determine how the other lines line up. So in this particular example, all the space before hello and before world would be truncated from the string, and you'd end up with hello, new line, world, new line. For Windows, just to note that the carriage return is not automatically added. So if you need to add a carriage return, you have to add \R. Similarly, if you wanted white space to the right of any of these particular lines, you can add the \S, and all the white space between the \S and the non-white space will be preserved. Another new feature is records. Records are a restricted class similar to like enums. And all you need to do is specify the components of the record. The compiler will default private final fields for these read accessor methods with the same names as the components, an equals method, a hash code method, and a constructor. So there really isn't much that you need to do. You can add additional fields, but they have to be static fields. And you'll see in this particular example, we just set a point with the values 100 and 200. Now the values are immutable, and you'll see here that to access it, we use the X method to get the X component. Another new feature is instance of pattern matching. And what this does is that there's a common pattern used in code where you test for the instance of a class, and then once that's true, you cast the input value to that type. This allows you to do this all in one statement. So in this particular case, we end up with a string value assigned to S, and then we can now access the string methods from S. Now, if you're using this in an if-else statement, something to note is that the variable that you've added at the end of the instance of is only accessible to the true case. So if you say if O instance of string S, the then block can then access the S variable, but the else statement cannot. Similarly, if you say if not O instance of string S, the else block would be the one to be able to access the S variable. Sealed classes are also a new feature. This allows a class to specify which classes are able to implement or extend the class or interface. It uses a new modifier, the sealed modifier, and has a new clause, the permits clause, which specifies which classes are allowed to extend. Any class that extends a sealed class must specify its sealed behavior. So it's either one of final class, so it can no longer be extended. Sealed, it could also seal that class and specify what may extend it, or it can specify non-sealed. In the case of non-sealed, all subsequent classes may be permitted to extend that particular class. The sealed classes and the ones that extend them need to be in the same module. So there's also some new cleanups that have been added. One of them is the remove unnecessary array creation. Basically what this does is for certain methods that take var args, instead where an array has been created, it simply disassembles the array and passes the components directly. In the case of where methods, there are more than one method of the same name and there is some ambiguity. So for example, another as-list method that takes a first parameter of string, the cleanup does not initiate. Another important cleanup is to simplify lambda expressions. There's a number of features to this simplification. First of all, if the parameter is untyped and there's a single parameter, if there are parentheses around it, those are removed. If there are brackets, if there is a single statement and it is surrounded in brackets, those are removed. If there's a return statement, again, single statement, the return is removed. And finally, if possible, a method reference will be provided. Another cleanup is merging if-else blocks with the same content. So if an if and an else if also have the same body content, then they can be combined into an expression and compact the code. For the object equals method, a common pattern for testing equality has to do with the fields, testing the fields themselves. And this cleanup, there's a cleanup that recognizes that and replaces that field test with the object equals call, and again, compacts your equals method. There's a cleanup for pre-compiling regex expressions that are reused. So for example, there's a number of string methods that take a regex expression, and for each one of these calls, this causes a pattern to be compiled, and this can be wasteful in the case of where you're making multiple calls in this particular example. So the cleanup, what the cleanup does is it creates a pattern, a local pattern, and then uses the pattern to perform those functions that you were trying to do, so that the pattern only gets compiled once. In 418 M1, there's a new improvement where the pattern is actually moved to a final static field if possible. Some miscellaneous cleanups are also added. One is to clarify negation expressions so that it pushes it down, and something like the left-hand side there becomes much clearer. Another cleanup is to make sure that the long literal suffix, which can be a lowercase l or uppercase L, is always uppercase L, just to remove any ambiguity as between the L and the number 1. There's another cleanup to use the var type reserved identifier where possible for Java 10 and up. There's another one to replace calls to the key set or values of a map directly using the map methods. And then finally, there's a cleanup to replace eager logical operators with lazy operators. So in the example given, instead of evaluating each side of the OR using the lazy OR operator, it can be short-circuited. In the quick fix, quick assist category, there's a new surround with try with resources statement. If you select a set of code and the first line or first multiple lines start with declarations of auto-closable objects, a try with resources statement will be created so that the auto-closable objects will be closed on exit, whether there's an exception or whether the code exits normally. If there's multiple auto-closable declarations at the top, all of them will appear in the single try. There's another new some miscellaneous quick assists here and quick fixes. One of them is when you're dealing with optional, you might get an error trying to assign, for example, an integer constant, and this will provide the ability to wrap such constants with optional.of. And for types, you can wrap in optional.of, optional.of nullable, or create an optional empty. There's some quick fixes for a module info file. For the Javadoc tags, the new Javadoc tags for @uses and @provides, in case they're missing or duplicate. Yeah, for a switch expression, the old version of a switch expression used if you use a return statement in a switch expression, that's not correct. You need to use yield statements. So there's a quick assist for changing those over. And an additional, there's a quick assist where you can replace a string concatenation with a string format. Sometimes this can clarify why you're formatting the code. In the editor, a new completion has been added for postfix completion. And what this does is this allows constructs to be created in context with the item before. So for example, in this particular example, the list.for will create a for statement that will loop over all the values of list. There's another new completion, substring completion. So in certain cases, you might know there's a method and it's got the word point in it, but you don't necessarily know what that method is. So the substring completion will find matches where the text is part, or at least substring part of the field or method. Another new completion is the subword type completion, so that when types are being completed, priority is given to types that are a valid match for the context. So in this particular example, we're assigning to a collection, and we know the type starts with H, so it puts the collection types in the front, like hash set, before offering just random types that start with the letter H. Some miscellaneous editor changes are also the new record creation wizard. There's a new shortcut for creating the text block. There's some content assist templates in an empty file so that you can create a new class, an interface, a record, or an enum. There is a corresponding to the surround with try with resources quick assist. There's a new item added to the surround with menu that performs the similar behavior. As mentioned before, there's Javadoc parsing for a module info, looking at uses and provides tags. There's new indent formatting for the text blocks. There's formatting options for adding a space after the not operator. There's formatting options for record declaration, Javadoc tags, and for controlling the line wrap of assert statements. In the compiler, two new features are there's a warning that's been added when you're converting annotated parameterized types to less annotated types. So for example, if you're passing a list that is guaranteed to have no nulls strings in it, and you're passing this as a list string to a method, there's an info warning for that by default. You can change the severity of that via the error warnings under null analysis. There's also improved resource leak detection. So now it will recognize fluent programming, for example, methods that return lists that are chained together and won't give you extraneous warnings or errors. And it also tracks auto-closable resources much better. On the performance side, non-blocking completion has been added. In the past, completion was using the UI thread, which could possibly freeze the UI. So the JDT extensions for completion have been modified to be non-blocking and not require the UI thread. There's a special flag for the extension to specify that the extension doesn't use the UI thread. So if all of the completion extensions that are chosen are non-blocking, a regular thread will be used instead of the UI thread. It was gradually phased in, so there was an option, and that preference is now defaulted to be on. Under debug, there's an option to avoid hitting an exception breakpoint more than once per exception instance. This can happen when a exception is rethrown, and you may only be interested in the first case. Lambda expressions are now supported where debug expressions are entered, for example, a breakpoint expression. The debugger is now capable of inspecting compiler synthetic variables. These are variables created by the compiler. You can also now inspect, evaluate expressions with anonymous classes. And there's a new option to show the actual type names in variable and expression views. In this particular case, you must be out of column mode. This would be useful, for example, in the case of a collection of objects, and being able to see what each object actually is and to use its to see its value. There's a new launch configuration for Java 14 or higher that gives further details about exceptions. In this particular case, it's just the null pointer exception. And so it will actually tell you what was null. So for example, a statement like a.b.c.e, and if C was null, it would tell you that that was the case, so that you don't have to wonder what caused the null exception. In the JUnit view, there's a new option to collapse all nodes. And there's also the ability to sort the test results. By default, the test results are sorted in execution order, but you can specify execution time or name. When you sort by execution time, it's from highest time taken to lowest. So as I mentioned, 418M1 is out, and there's some new stuff in there. I'll just give you a preview. One is to be example to convert loops that are initializing an array to use arrays.fill method instead. There's a simplification of redundant if-else code to compact that. In that particular example, we can just return 1. There's code to convert a switch statement that assigns values to a switch expression. There are some rules with that, but where applicable is kind of the best way to specify that. There is code to recognize a loop that is adding or removing all elements and change to use add all or remove all methods. There's code to convert to using the pattern matching for instance of, which we saw earlier. So recognize that you're checking for an instance of a type and then casting it. There's also recognition of code that creates a collection and then initializes the values to simply condense that to initialize the collection in the constructor. And finally, there is a quick assist to create an implementation of an interface or an abstract class. So for further information, for example, for the Java 15 and examples, I've given you a link for the wiki there. If you're not already looking at the Holger Verman YouTube channel, I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful condensation of all the new features for each Eclipse release. And it doesn't take very long, and there's some great demos. If you want to see the actual new and notables for JDT, I've also provided the links here. So now I'm going to switch to the chat to answer any questions. So there's a question from Michael Kepler. Is there any chance for recognizing @check return value also in addition to the hard-coded Fluent API list? I would just suggest opening a feature bug, and we'll certainly look into it. And I see there's no more questions. So thank you very much for attending my talk. And if there's any other questions, my email address is provided on the first slide if you want to get in contact with me. Also, thanks to all of the JDT developers who contributed to the releases.